I drove for 9 long hours, covering miles in the relentless rain, as if nature itself was trying one last time to stop me, to keep me from what I could no longer, and would not, change, and the bone-chilling cold was felt in my knees, where the old arthritis was a dull, throbbing ache, every turn of the wheel, every press of the brake a reminder that time takes its toll, and the body, once it fails, is never the same again. On the passenger seat next to me, wrapped in a linen tea towel, rested the carrot cake I had baked the day before with the trepidation of a mother preparing to surprise her grown daughter on her 50th birthday, because despite years of coldness, brief calls, and infrequent visits, I still had that same foolish, unbidden hope that one gesture of love, even in the form of home baking, could change everything. I stopped the car in front of their house, not looking at it through the cloudy glass on which the water drew strange paths, took the pie, squeezing it tightly, as if it contained not baked goods, but a heart that I had once again decided to entrust to them, and, without using the umbrellas that were lying on the back seat, I entered the gate, soaking wet within a minute, because at that moment I was not the widow Veronica, but a mother thirsting for warmth, when I opened the door, without thinking, as I always did before, I heard laughter, ringing, joyful, the kind that used to bring me comfort, but now seemed alien, repulsive, almost mocking, and, listening, I distinguished Camilla's voice, clear and crystalline, like a winter morning, when she said, "God, I hope it breaks," and, not believing my ears, holding my breath, I froze, as if my body instinctively refused to breathe, not wanting to let in the poison of what I had heard. And her husband, Leonardo, with that lazy mockery that always hid indifference, added, or at least disappear. "Give us a guilt-free weekend," and they both laughed so easily, so casually, as if they were talking about an annoying neighbor or a joke on a TV show, not realizing that their words were a knife, and I felt it go in slowly, carefully, as if someone deliberately wanted me to feel every millimeter of pain, and I, without saying a word, walked into the kitchen, put the pie on the counter, without even taking off my shoes, and left without looking back, because something inside me had finally broken, like a thin thread that was held together only by the belief in the possibility of forgiveness. 9 days later I changed my will, and I did it not with bitterness or vindictiveness, as those who knew me superficially might have thought, but with that strange, almost detached calm that comes to a person who has finally put an end to a letter he has been unable to finish for years. And 3 weeks later, when they began to call me in a panic, when their credit cards, one after another, began to be rejected, when the usual carefree life failed, I did not answer the phone. At 78. For the first time, I really felt what it was like not to be a puppet in someone's hands, but to be myself, free from expectations and the fear of loneliness. Now the rain, the same one I rode through to Millbrook, was no longer a symbol of suffering for me. It became a cleansing, washing away the pain of the past, because I realized that even the heaviest storms do not last forever, and when they go away, only the earth remains on which to build anew. And even though my joints still ache, even though my heart still sometimes remembers the past with a tremor, I have found that strength that is not measured by the amount of experience, but determined by the fact that you choose not to endure anymore. And before we continue, write in the comments from which city you are watching this video. Enjoy. I, Veronica Russo, widow of David, who passed away 12 years ago, a woman who beat cancer, a retired librarian whose morning begins with alphabetizing spices, have finally learned to stop being the needy, unnoticed, submissive mother who silently waited for the phone to ring, and to start being the one who reclaims respect, not by screaming, but by quiet, decisive action, like a storm that comes unscheduled but changes everything. After David died, I stayed in our 2-story colonial in Millbrook because the walls, the cracks in the plaster, the creaking steps of the stairs, even the old brass knob on the kitchen door held more than just memories. They were a living part of my daily routine, my company, where every morning began with the familiar hum of the coffee maker and the click of the bathroom switch, as if the house were trying to continue the life we once led together. I lived alone, but I did not feel lonely. His cardigan, still hanging on the bedroom door, had become something more than just an item of clothing for me. It contained the fabric of his scent, his warmth, his silent support, especially on those winter evenings when the lights of the neighboring houses did not come on in the window for a long time, and I, having brewed herbal tea, went into the garden, the same one that David had planted many years ago, when Camilla was still a teenager, and helped him plant lilacs, which she then pruned too early, causing him to pretend to grumble. Now the garden flourished under my caring hands. Every shoot, Every branch, every drooping flower was my attempt to preserve what was passing, dissolving in time, like steam over a cup of tea, and it seemed to me that through the care of this small piece of land I was talking to it, as if it answered me through the blooming of peonies and the persistence of lavender. The relationship with my only daughter, Camilla, had cooled off years ago, but I stubbornly pretended not to notice this gradually growing rift, because to acknowledge it would be to admit my own inability to preserve the most important thing that fate had entrusted to me, a connection with the one I gave birth to and raised in love. Our weekly conversations, which once stretched out for half an hour, or even more, when Camilla told me how she copes with the little ones, how Leonardo irritated her with his habit of leaving wet towels on the bed, became shorter and shorter, and her voice sounded more tense every time I, good-naturedly, casually, mentioned that it would be nice to see each other or invite them to dinner. Their excuses multiplied like weeds after a June rain, and each new explanation, whether it was work commitments, home renovations, Spanish classes, or social events where their presence was supposedly mandatory, became another barrier between us that I tried not to look at. Last Christmas, instead of coming home as we'd agreed, they went to Barbados, and then, clutching a mug of cold mulled wine, I saw Instagram photos of Camilla posing against a backdrop of palm trees, cocktail in hand, and Leonardo, shirt unbuttoned, knee-deep in turquoise water, and it was like a punch in the air that took your breath away, not because they were there, but because they hadn't thought to tell you. He said later that the work was crazy, and I nodded, as always, as if I understood everything, as if I hadn't seen what everyone else saw, the sunset, the yachts, the big smiles, and I blamed myself. Maybe I really had become too needy, too melancholy, the same widow who can't let go of the past and demands that others carry her pain. And yet, despite everything, I continued to send packages, with love, with trepidation, with the stubbornness that only a mother can have, homemade cookies wrapped in parchment paper, hand-knitted scarves whose patterns I knitted at night, staring into the silence, and birthday checks whose amount increased from year to year, as if I hoped that bills could make up for what attention could not return. I became the grandmother who waits by the phone, keeps a notebook with the dates of school parties handy, and saves newspaper clippings with the names of her grandchildren that they never even bother to read. But what I could never have imagined, as, indeed, no mother can imagine, especially one who truly loved, is how completely, meticulously, and methodically they learned to monetize my love, credit cards that I guaranteed while they were on their feet, until Camilla went on maternity leave, until Leonardo opened his business, which turned into a profitable chain of salons. I took out loans on their first house, and then on their second, and on another one on the coast, the beach house they had told me about with such excitement, but which, as it turned out, they bought because they couldn't afford plane tickets to come to my birthday party. Now, when it rains, it no longer sounds like a warning, a threat, a despair. It falls steadily, almost blessedly, because I now understand that even the heaviest downpours don't last forever. When the financial dominoes I had patiently and invisibly placed for so long began to fall, one by one, and when their carefully constructed lives began to crumble without my silent support, I didn't feel satisfaction. I felt clarity, that rare clarity that comes not from revenge, but from the understanding that strength lies not only in what you can endure, but in what you refuse to accept. It took me 2 days to make the cake. First I baked 3 dense, aromatic layers, soaked in a subtle combination of cinnamon, nutmeg, and fragrant vanilla. Then I covered them with a thick, smooth cream cheese icing, trying to spread it evenly, so that not a single piece would be deprived of the tenderness that I put into every stroke of the spatula. And then, already in the evening, when the silence of the house again enveloped me like a blanket, I sat down at the table and, despite the aching pain in my fingers, sculpted 24 miniature carrots from orange marzipan, each of which required 10 minutes of patience and precision, rolling, pinching, attaching a tiny green stem, arranging in a circle, like a small marzipan garden, carefully planted on a snow-white blanket of icing. And all this, not because I expected gratitude, but because the memory of 7-year-old Camille, solemnly dismissing the chocolate cake as banal, was more alive than all her recent messages put together. On baking day, I woke before dawn, when the sky over Millbrook was just beginning to change from its velvety gray to a softer, smoky blue, when everything was so quiet you could hear the old pipes crackling in the wall, and I pulled on David's robe, which always kept me warm, and went into the kitchen, where I softened the butter first, cut it into cubes as my mother had taught me, put it on the warm stove, grated the carrots until my wrists trembled slightly, and, as I folded the eggs and sugar and spices into the dough, felt an almost physical connection with the women who had stood at those stoves before me, with my mother, her mother, with generations of caring, stubborn, sometimes insufferable but always loving women from whose hands came not just dishes but acts of love and comfort and belonging. David, if he had been alive, would have come up to me and, with mock cunning, dipped his finger into the bowl of icing, then licked it like a schoolboy, and, despite my grumbling protests, would have repeated it twice more until I slapped his hand with a rag. But now that he was gone, I dipped my finger into the bowl myself, smiling softly, and tasted it, as if giving in to the little ritual that connected me with his absence. "Are you coming all this way alone?" Isabella had asked when I told her my intention, standing on the other side of the hedge that separated our drives, a floral secretary in her hand, her gray curls escaping from under her favorite gardening hat, which she had been wearing since late April, as if spring itself, in the person of this woman, was never going to give up its position. Isabella and I had been neighbors for 32 years, ever since she moved in after her divorce from her lawyer husband, who she later told me over a glass of wine was a sucker for other people's secretaries, and she had been a part of my world ever since, helping care for Camille when she was sick in elementary school, making me casseroles during the worst days of chemotherapy, coming over in the evenings with books, knowing that sometimes the story of someone else's fiction is the best escape from your own pain. "This isn't the Oregon Trail, Isabella," I told her, adjusting the cake stand in the trunk, wedging it between two cushions to keep it from sliding around on the turns. "I'm driving the interstate, not the migrant trail." "The weather forecast calls for heavy rain all the way to Connecticut," she grumbled, clearly still trying to reason with me, but in a tone that was closer to concern than reproach. "And your knees?" "My knees and I have come to an understanding," I shrugged, adding with a grin, "they complain, and I ignore them, like you ignore my advice not to drink a third cup of coffee after lunch." She didn't answer right away, just gave me that long look that only women who have experienced too much loss to believe in coincidences know, and finally murmured, "At least pick up the phone. And call me when you get there." "Yes, Mom," I teased, though we were the same age and our roles changed depending on the situation. "Someone has to take care of you," she said with a slight smile, heading off to her roses. I left at 4:30 in the morning, taking with me in an expensive travel bag my favorite wool cardigan and a tube of lavender hand cream, the smell of which Camilla adored as a child. It calmed her before bed, and I hoped that maybe she would recognize it. A thermos of coffee stood in the cup holder, and its rich aroma, with a hint of cinnamon, filled the car, and the soft melody from the radio station to which David and I danced in the kitchen when Camilla was still too small to reach the countertop lay in the background of my thoughts. It started raining soon after I left Millbrook, first a few drops, then a steady downpour, the drops hitting the windscreen with a sound like someone was whispering something important to me, and I found myself talking out loud, as people who have lived alone for a long time often do. "You should have listened to Isabella," I told myself, tightening my grip on the wheel, feeling the arthritis in my fingers growing, trying not to think about how many more hours of driving lay ahead, because the point wasn't getting there, it was being there, waiting for a miracle, even if only subconsciously. I knew there were 9 hours of driving ahead, 9 hours of pain, of concentration, of remembering, of doubt, but what was 9 hours compared to her surprise when she saw me at her door? I imagined her opening it, her eyes widening, her hands reaching up to her face, her lips trembling with surprise, and maybe for the first time in years she would hug me for real. The highway stretched out before me, a river of asphalt disappearing in streams of rain that sometimes thickened into a thick curtain hiding the outlines of the world, sometimes parted, allowing only a moment to look ahead, as if nature itself were testing my determination to reach the end of the road, not to turn, not to stop, not to give in to doubt. Trucks rushed past, huge, roaring, like monsters from a dream, and every time I overtook one of them or, conversely, let it pass me, streams of water broke off from its wheels, splashing the windshield with such force that the world disappeared for a second, and each time I froze, gripping the steering wheel a little tighter, straightening my back, and then slowly exhaled again, as if I had passed the test. I slowed to 55, then 50, punching forward in the hope that those few inches closer to the windshield would help me see the road better, even though common sense told me that my vision was long gone, and no amount of inches would do the trick. On the seat next to me, securely fastened between the seatbelt and a folded wool blanket, was a container of cake, my physical manifestation of love, hope, and that desperate desire to still believe that there was something between mother and daughter that could withstand the years, and the cold, and disappointments, and even indifference. At a rest stop in Massachusetts, I climbed out of the car, wincing at the pain in my knees, which were particularly protesting, and, holding on to the railing, walked into a building with fluorescent lights, cold tile walls, and a smell that was a mix of cheap cleaning product and something else, unidentifiable but persistently irritating. In the bathroom, looking at my reflection in the mirror, a tired face, creased by the headrest and the marks of time, as if the glass itself were looking at me with regret, I rubbed an icy, pungent painkiller into my knees, trying not to groan out loud. A uniformed employee, her expression wary but kind, handed me a paper towel and, tilting her head slightly, asked, "Long drive ahead?" I nodded, trying to force a smile that probably came out as something between a grimace and a spasm. "About halfway there," I said, and she nodded, noting that the weather might get worse. "Maybe we should wait?" But I knew better. Birthdays don't have a reschedule button, no room for being late, especially when you're hoping a surprise might break the ice. I'd planned to arrive carefully, in time for the dinner Camilla had mentioned in passing the last time we talked, a couple of friends, nothing special. I hadn't told her I was coming, not because I wanted to startle her or make her feel awkward, but because if I had said so in advance, her voice would have become formal, impersonal, politely distant, like a note from the receptionist. The surprise was my way of getting around the wall, of breaking through the cold calculation to which she seemed to have accustomed herself, and me, too. Back on the road, I turned on the heater, trying to displace the dampness that had already taken up residence in my spine, and, glancing at the clock on the dashboard, 9:47 a.m., I noted that I had about 5 hours left, unless the weather decided to interfere with my plans again. I swallowed an ibuprofen, wincing at the bitterness that always seemed to creep in more slowly than it should have, and, to distract myself, allowed myself to wander back in my mind to those birthdays when Camilla had still looked at me with admiration. 6 years old, her face beaming as she unfurls the dollhouse I furnished in secret evenings, tiny curtains made from an old lace doily, frames into which I'd carefully pasted miniature versions of our family photographs, 12, candles on a cake shaped like a stack of books, because her obsession with Nancy Drew had reached its peak and she wanted to solve crimes but still kiss me goodnight, 16. The necklace I'd been saving up for months didn't seem grown up enough to her, but within a few weeks she was wearing it almost every day. When did it all change? When did my voice become an irritant to her, and my presence an obligation she had to brace herself for with an inner effort? I can't put my finger on the exact moment. Maybe it was after David died, when my grief became too loud, too sticky, too all-consuming, or when she married Leonardo, with his world of brightly lit rooms and polished glasses and country club evenings, where people like me seemed oddly out of place, like antiques that no longer fit into a modern setting. Or maybe it was when I got sick, and the need to care for me became less of a concern and more of a threat to her carefully constructed life. The rain picked up as I drove into Connecticut, pounding the roof of the car with an impatience that seemed to say, "Hurry, it's all coming soon," and up ahead, at the turn, a traffic accident, cars on jack stands, lights flashing, drivers passing on the wrong side of the road, all of it reminding me for a moment how fragile everything was, and my GPS recalculated the route, adding 45 minutes. By midday, my body was a symphony of woe, a nagging ache in my lower back, a stiff neck, a throbbing in my knees that still made it through the pill, but I felt like my resolve was a kind of painkiller, developed over years of motherhood. I'd driven through snowstorms to get to a school play before, and trudged through flooded roads to get to graduation, and now, with carrot cake and a container of hope in the passenger seat, I knew that neither rain nor pain would stop me. And then, through the gray curtain of rain, the suburbs of Hartford began to appear, familiar signs, familiar turns, and something in my chest tightened, not with fear, but with anticipation. I looked at my reflection in the rearview mirror and froze for a moment, as if I were seeing not the me of today, but the woman I once knew, but of whom only fragments remained, lipstick faded like a leaf of an autumn hydrangea, hair stuck to one side of my cheek, damp, tousled, as if after a sleepless night, because I had been leaning against the window all morning, as if hoping to feel the warmth of her gaze through the glass. But it didn't matter. I could tidy myself up before showing up in her house, in her life, at her birthday party, the one to which I had not been invited, but which I had come to anyway, because I was a mother, because the heart, even when exhausted, does not recognize schedules. The rain, as if understanding the importance of the moment, suddenly stopped, giving way to silence, clarity, rare and frightening, like the moment between inhalation and exhalation. The houses around stood proudly, detachedly, with well-groomed facades, mown lawns, and identical flags on the mailboxes, as if they belonged to another world where there was no place for accidents and wet mothers with pies in their hands. Camilla's house, the largest on the cul-de-sac, stood out not only for its size but for the warm light that poured in from the windows, and in the darkening afternoon resembled the window of a cozy cafe where everyone had their tables and their orders, but there was no place for you. Through the front window I could see movement, silhouettes sliding back and forth, with plates and glasses, heads slightly inclined to the side as they spoke, preparing for a party where my name and seat were not. I parked across the street because I suddenly realized that to pull into the driveway was to intrude, to violate, and I didn't want to intrude. I wanted to be a surprise, a miracle, a fond memory. Carefully lifting the container of cake, I checked each marzipan carrot as if their neatness could affect the outcome of the upcoming meeting, and, taking a deep breath, I stepped out into the residual rain, cold but no longer merciless. It was only 20 feet to their door, but every step through my soaking wet cloak was in my knees, my back, my heart, and when I finally reached the entrance, the water was already running down my collar, seeping into my comfortable shoes, making me feel not like a guest, but an outsider. I didn't ring the bell. The door was ajar, as it always was when they were expecting guests, but now I realized that this guest was not me. I stepped into the hallway, and a small puddle began to form on my shoes, from which drops ran across the immaculate marble floor. It smelled of rosemary and garlic and something else, fried, warm, homey, like those dinner parties to which I had once been invited, before I became a reminder of the pain they did not want to see. The house exuded neatness, glitz, impeccable aesthetics. On a console table that had cost more than my first car lay catalogs, neatly stacked like proof of taste. On the walls, the paintings, the ones Camille had once called intellectually daring, though to me they were mere daubs, were now hung at the perfect angle, as if justifying their presence with a price tag. The framed photos were of friends, beaches, children, even neighbors, but not of me. I stood there, holding my breath, holding the box of cake that had suddenly become unbearably heavy, not because of its weight, but because of its contents, because of all the love it contained. Voices came from the kitchen, and Camille's laughter interrupted the conversation like the tinkling of glass. I began to move, slowly, step by step, mentally rehearsing how I would enter. Surprise. Too silly, happy birthday, dear, too formal, even hello sounded like an intrusion. I was about to turn the corner when I heard my name, and stopped. Mum called again this morning, Camilla said, and there was that tension in her voice that I had learned to hear whenever she picked up the phone. That's the third time this week. What did she want this time? Leonardo's voice was lazily mocking, like a man tired of being polite. Same as always, to talk about nothing, he said. To remind her that she's alone. To make us feel guilty for having a life. I froze. The hands holding the cake began to shake, not from the effort, but from the way words could cut to the quick. At least she didn't invite herself to your birthday party, he added, with that cold mockery that was unmistakable. Remember last year? 5 days. Don't remind me, Camille sighed. I had to hide in the bedroom to get some rest. I stood there, unable to move, feeling the rain from the hem of my coat falling on the polished oak, and every sound, every word, every memory that broke through from their voices hit me harder than any refusal. She mentioned that she might come, Camille continued. I told her we were busy. Good. The last thing we needed was her showing up unannounced. The irony of the situation would have seemed almost comical to me, if it had not been so excruciating. I was already here. I was standing around the corner. And everything they were afraid to hear was already happening. I pictured them as they must have been, Camilla standing at the kitchen island, carefully chopping vegetables, the same concentrated frown between her brows that she had as a child, coloring mandalas or trying to tie a bow on a ballet slipper, and Leonardo, tall and silent, stirring something on the stove, the rich aroma of spices and oil coming from him, making the kitchen look like a cozy restaurant with subdued lighting and the promise of comfort. Their home life seemed harmonious, but everything in their movements, in their glances, in the arrangement of dishes and utensils seemed rehearsed, as if each movement were part of a performance in which they were playing the roles of a married couple whose affection was shown to each other rather than truly felt. God, I hope she breaks up, Camilla said, and my heart seemed to stop beating, and time seemed to compress itself into a knot, sharp and painful. Then we won't have to answer her constant calls, she added, and there was a weariness in her voice, as if my concern was a burden she wanted to get rid of. Leonardo laughed, not with restraint, not nervously, but sincerely, like a man who thought what he had said was witty. Or at least let him get lost, he said. Give us a guilt-free weekend. Their laughter merged into one, honey and poison in one gulp, and the box of cake, which I still held in my trembling hands, suddenly felt unbearably heavy. This girl, my girl, whom I carried in my arms when she was sick, whom I drove to late-night doctor's appointments, whom I sat with while she wrote an essay on photosynthesis, whose tears I consoled with ice cream and my favorite blanket, had just expressed a wish for me to die, and her husband, the one who promised to be part of our family, who swore to respect and care, simply laughed. I don't remember making the decision to move forward. My body carried me into the kitchen, past the glossy walls, past the shiny shelves and frames without my face, as if there was no will in it anymore, only impulse. And it was just as I had imagined, Camilla chopping vegetables, Leonardo stirring something aromatic, their faces turned towards each other, their movements synchronized, like a dance, and when they turned around, hearing my footsteps, their faces turned pale, their eyes widened, their mouths opened, like in an old Hollywood movie, in silent circles of horror. At that moment, time stood still. I saw how panic ran through Camilla's eyes, how her mind tried to understand what exactly I had heard, and how quickly it could all turn into a misunderstanding. Leonardo immediately tensed, his face became hard, like a man mentally building lines of defense. Camilla raised her hand to her throat, a gesture I recognized immediately, because it was my gesture. We both made it when we could not find the words, when we did not know how to say it without destroying. I did not say a word. I did not cry, did not reproach, did not ask questions. I simply walked up to the counter, put the cake box down, adjusted the edge of the lid so the icing wouldn't move, turned around and walked towards the exit, just as silently as I had come in. Mom, Camilla called, her voice shaking, but I didn't stop. Mom, wait. I was already in the rain, which had started to drizzle again, cold and enveloping, but I walked faster than my aching knees would allow, because I knew that if I stopped, I wouldn't get away. As I walked back to my car, to the road I had come on, I heard Leonardo's voice join Camilla's. Please. Veronica. That's not what we meant. But behind those words, confused, hurried, late, I closed the car door, inserted the key into the ignition with hands that no longer trembled. Because at that moment everything became crystal clear. What a strange, paradoxical feeling, this clarity that comes not in happy hours but in moments of total collapse. The windshield wipers scraped the glass in a rhythm that had become almost hypnotic, left, right, truth, love, disappointment, departure. In the rearview mirror I saw them running out after me, Camilla with her hands to her chest, Leonardo with his arm around her shoulders, both of them standing like children who have lost something important. They seemed small, pale, alien, and the further I drove, the less significant their silhouettes became, until they dissolved into the gray evening air. I did not turn around again. Has someone ever betrayed your trust so deeply that you had no choice but to leave? If so, you'll understand. Sometimes the hardest thing is not realizing you're not loved, but choosing to walk away from those you still love. The rain picked up as I pulled onto the highway, as if nature itself had decided to provide me with a curtain of water, not protection, no, a stage on which one life was ending. My clothes clung to my skin, cold, soaking wet, but I barely felt it. The physical discomfort seemed distant, secondary to the silence, the emptiness, the light, strange ease inside. The passenger seat, now empty, felt orphaned. I found myself turning to say something to Camille, and remembering she was gone. My phone vibrated in my bag, first once, then twice, then a string of messages began, like raindrops on glass, relentless, constant. I didn't need to look at the screen. I knew who it was. Camille. Trying to take back, to sew up, to cover up. I silently switched the volume to silent. Where do you go when home is an illusion? When the love you held onto is not a root but a hook? When everything you cherished is exposed as a politely worded obligation? A road stretched out before me, a ribbon of possibilities, none of which led to what I had thought was true just an hour ago, because what I had believed in for years, what I had invested my love, patience, care in, was just a decoration, fragile and unreliable, like an old curtain behind which no one has played for a long time. I drove aimlessly, almost on autopilot, ignoring signs, not choosing a direction, just moving forward, away, until the gas light came on, reminding me that even in my hour of spiritual desolation, there are things that cannot be ignored, needs that must be met, no matter how much my heart aches. Through the curtain of rain, I spotted a motel, a typical roadside structure with a peeling sign that flashed neon letters saying vacancy, as if it were winking at me, offering not only shelter but temporary refuge from a world that had become alien. I turned into it without thinking, turned off the engine, took out the keys and went into the reception area, which smelled like a mixture of cheap disinfectant and old cigarettes, and a tired woman in knitted gloves handed me the key to room number 7, barely looking at me, as if she knew that I was one of those who needed silence. The flower bed under the window was sad, a few wilted petunias, a lonely gnome with a chipped hat, an attempt at coziness doomed to failure. I sat on the edge of the bed, still dressed, feeling the damp clothes sticking to my back but unable to change anything, and stared at the wallpaper with a pale floral pattern until my eyes began to unfocus and the lines began to tremble like an old TV. For the first time since I heard their voices, those devastating, cool words, I allowed myself to feel everything, not the hurt, not the anger, but a pure, solid heaviness, as if something huge and invisible were pressing down on my chest, choking me out. This wasn't just a hurtful comment, thrown out in a moment of fatigue or irritation. It was the pinnacle, the culmination of years, decades, of my love being reduced to awkwardness, my care to annoyance, my presence to a burden. My daughter hadn't rejected me as a guest, she had rejected me as part of her life. My phone rang 17 times that night. I didn't answer. I lay on my bed, my shoes still on, my arms wrapped around myself as if that would keep me from falling apart. By morning, the light was filtering through the thin curtains, and it was not soft and comforting, like a house that smells of coffee and fresh bread, but harsh, uncompromising, revealing. I slept in my clothes, not because I didn't want to change, but because I was numb, my body, my thoughts, my desires, everything was frozen. My phone went silent around 2 in the morning. The battery had died from the incessant notifications. In the bathroom, under the cold light, I barely recognized the woman in the mirror. The eyes that had once reflected living pain and bright hope now seemed empty, and the wrinkles around the mouth had deepened, as if the skin itself remembered my fatigue. I took a shower, put on the same clothes, dried them with a hairdryer as best I could, and turned on the phone. 27 missed calls, 42 messages. Camilla wrote, "Mom, please call me back. You got it all wrong." And again, it was a joke, stupid, inappropriate, but not mean. And from Leonardo, "Veronica, let us explain. It's not what you think." And then again Camilla, "Mom, I'm worried. Where are you? It's not fair. You're scaring me." The last message was a threat masquerading as concern. "If you don't answer, I'll have to call the police." But I knew it was a bluff. Camilla couldn't explain why her elderly mother, caring, devoted, had left her birthday party in tears and without a word. I turned the phone face down and paused, considering my options. I could go home and pretend nothing had happened, or I could go back to them and demand an explanation, an apology, compensation, but each of those thoughts felt like a step back into the abyss I'd just emerged from. It wasn't the first time, the first betrayal. There had been before, the Christmas they'd canceled because Leonardo had the flu, then posted photos of us skiing, my visit, only to have my things removed from the guest bathrooms so their friends wouldn't feel awkward, the gift Leonardo's niece had sent me, addressed to Mr. and Mrs. Richards, as if I were just a distant acquaintance. I thought back on these moments, once dismissed as random omissions, but now forming a distinct pattern, indifference masked by politeness, distance cloaked in smiles. I couldn't ignore the truth any longer. So instead of going back to my house, where every stain on the tablecloth reminded me of Camille, or to hers, where the walls seemed deaf to my love, I entered a new address into my GPS, a small rental in White Plains, close enough to go back to if I needed to, but far enough to breathe. The phone rang again, not Camille, not Leonardo. Isabella. Thank God. I'd been calling since yesterday. Are you okay? Camille called. She said something was wrong. Her voice was tense as a string. I sat on the bed, hugging myself, and answered evenly, almost in a whisper. I heard them, Isabella. I heard my daughter say she hoped I'd crash. Silence. Long, exactly 3 heartbeats. Where are you? She finally asked, and her voice trembled not only with worry but also with rage, for me, for all those years when I had remained silent. I'm going to White Plains, I answered. Okay. Don't go back there. Come home when you're ready. I have a bottle of Glenfiddich that David gave me before he died. I think it's time to open it. For the first time since I had stood in Camille's kitchen, surrounded by the scent of rosemary and the verbal fragments that had pierced my chest sharper than a knife, I felt the corner of my lips twitch slightly, touched by a smile, not from joy, no, happiness was still too far away, if it was still within reach, but this movement, almost instinctive, became for me a sign that I was still capable of reaction, of response, of recognition, albeit a sad truth. I may have lost my daughter, lost her trust, her closeness, her warm concern, but I was not alone, because in a world full of losses, there were still those who were there not out of duty, but out of love. I wrote to Isabella that I would be home in a few days, that I needed some time to organize not only my suitcase but my thoughts, and she, as always, wrote back in her direct and caustic manner, "Keep the scotch cold," to which I could not help but write back, "That is not how you drink scotch, pagan," and it was this light, almost meaningless exchange of words that became the first solid ground under my feet in 24 hours, as if the world, which had been teetering, was slowly but surely beginning to right itself. I disconnected, put the phone in my bag and continued driving, following the curves of the highway unfolding before me like a question to which I did not yet know the answer, but was ready to find it. The rain gradually died down, leaving behind a clean and quiet, and the world seemed to begin anew, fresh, transparent, but I still could not fully experience this renewal. Somewhere between the pain and the horizon, a tiny, stubborn spark was born in me, not forgiveness. It was too early to hope for that, perhaps it was not worth it at all, but something else, unknown, but mine. 3 days in a modest residence gave me a rare gift, solitude, in which there was no loneliness, because here no one knew my name, did not expect calls, did not judge by appearance, and for the first time in many years I could simply be, not a mother, not a widow, not in need, but a woman with silence in her head. I bought myself new clothes, practical, comfortable, made of soft fabrics, nothing in common with the flowered dresses that Camilla constantly offered me to wear, as if she wanted to make me the heroine of someone else's carefree, rustic novel. I turned off my phone, leaving only the calls from Isabella active, sharing the latest news, talking about Mr. Darcy, my lazy cat, who, according to her, lay on my chair, as if guarding it from oblivion. "You know they came by," she said one night, as we talked on the phone, half asleep. "Camilla and Leonardo. They knocked on your door, then mine." "What did you tell them?" I asked, keeping my voice down. "That you were safe and would contact me when you were ready." "Leonardo tried his charm tactics, but I'm old, not stupid," she snorted. "I can spot them a mile away." On the 4th morning, waking up earlier than usual, I called my bank without delay, my voice calm, even polite, despite the tremors in my chest. "I'd like to get information on all the accounts where I'm listed as a guarantor," I said after the standard identity verification process. The customer service representative on the other end of the line hesitated. "You mean the joint accounts, Mrs. Russo?" "No," I snapped, "the ones I provided financial security for. Credit cards, loans, anything where my assets could be used as collateral." What I learned next was more painful than hearing my daughter, the one for whom I had stayed alive after David's death, express a half-hearted wish for my death. For credit cards with a combined limit of $75,000, all under my responsibility. One personal loan for $30,000, taken out 2 years ago. The mortgage on their current home, where I had never spent the night, also with my signature as guarantor. When were these accounts issued? I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. The oldest one was 8 years ago, the specialist replied. The most recent one was 6 months ago. 6 months ago, when Camilla called me in tears, telling me how Leonardo's business was going, and when I offered to help, and she said, "Mom, we don't need charity, just moral support," and now I understood that moral support was not in words but in a signature, which was more valuable to them than my concern. After the bank, I contacted David's old investment advisor, the one he trusted like himself. "Mrs. Russo, what a pleasant coincidence," he said. "We haven't spoken for 5 years, maybe more." "I need a complete list of my assets," I said. "Everything that's left of David, everything I've acquired since then." He didn't ask questions. That same day, I received a resume in the mail. Our colonial house in Millbrook, which was now worth 3 times what we paid for it. David's life insurance, which, against many people's advice, I hadn't spent but invested. The pension from my teaching career, stable and wisely invested. The stocks I never bragged about but watched grow with the same patient attention I used to give Camille when she was helping her with her homework. And finally, the family heirlooms, my mother's sapphire ring, which I treasured like an amulet, and my grandfather David's collection of pocket watches, graceful, silent witnesses to the passage of time. All in all, just over $1,900,000, a figure that might have been a dream for someone else, but for me at that moment it sounded like a death sentence, confirmation that my last years had not only been given away but had been turned into a resource, a pool from which people drew without permission, justified by words of love, duty, or forgetfulness. It would have been almost enough for the beachfront property in Rhode Island that Camilla and Leonardo had discussed with particular excitement over dinner last year when I came for a rare visit, and they talked about how they wanted to retire by the ocean, adding that they barely had enough for the mortgage, much less enough to buy tickets to come visit me for Christmas. And yet, a beach house. The phrase itself had become a symbol for me now, not of the place, but of the boundary they had drawn between themselves and me, a boundary fenced in by my signatures. The final piece of the puzzle fell into place when I called Leonardo's mother, Marta, a level-headed woman, a little cold, but with that air of refined politeness that says we live in different worlds but don't have to fight. "Veronica, how sweet of you to call about the beach house," she exclaimed. "I know Camilla is so excited." I tried to keep my voice neutral, the one you practice at the bank or at a parent-teacher conference when everything inside you is screaming but you don't allow yourself to flinch. "The one they're closing next month?" I asked. "Yes," Martha answered easily. "The loan from his father and me helped a lot. Although I understand that you contributed, too." I didn't. At least not consciously. But now I was beginning to understand. My financial stability, carefully built with David, patiently preserved in solitude, had become their base, a quiet support that they took for granted. That night, I sat on my hotel bed, surrounded by sheets of paper, bank statements, copies of text messages, notes I'd scribbled in the margins of envelopes and checks, building, like a detective, a chronology not just of financial but of emotional manipulations so consistent, so precise, that they couldn't be called coincidences. Each drain on my emotional account corresponded to a real drain on my financial account, each cancelled appointment, a new plea for help, each ignored request, a new line of credit, each cold tone, a new mortgage guarantee. I thought of David, how he'd carefully prepared us for the future, how proud he'd been to keep me safe. "Take care of Camille," he'd told me a few days before he left. "But don't let her take advantage of your heart." I didn't understand then. Now, too well. What I saw in the hotel mirror was not an old woman, not a foolish woman, not a victim. I saw a shadow of the power that had once been me, the woman who had raised a daughter almost single-handedly while David was away serving around the world, the woman who had earned a master's degree at 40 while working full-time as a librarian and studying at night, the woman who had beaten cancer not through miracles but through determination, the woman for whom family betrayal had not been her first ordeal, and certainly not her worst. I made my last call that evening, to Francesca Moretti, my bridge partner, a woman with an iron will and a reputation as the toughest probate lawyer in the county. "I need to see you," I said as soon as she picked up. "It's about the will." "Camilla?" she asked, and there was no surprise in her voice. "Yes." And me. The time, she nodded curtly. My office. Thursday. 10 o'clock. When I hung up the phone, I felt no pain, no heaviness, just a cold, even confidence, like a surgeon about to perform a difficult operation. This wasn't revenge. This was justice. This was taking back my rights, starting with the woman looking back at me in the mirror. Francesca's office was just like her, austere, spacious, uninviting, full of glass surfaces and uncomfortable chairs designed to keep clients from lingering for long. She met me at the door, her fiery red hair styled in a bizarrely sharp wave, wearing shoes that added 3 inches to her height and 10 to her confidence. You look different, she said by way of greeting. I'm different, I said. She nodded, pointed to a chair, and I sat down. Tell me, she said. I told her. Everything. From 9 hours in the car in the rain, to words that left a hole in my chest, to conversations and documents, to understanding how deeply I had been deceived, not only in love, but in trust. Francesca listened without interrupting, taking notes in a clear, controlled handwriting, her face calm even in the most painful moments. When I finished, she asked directly, "Do you want to change your will?" "Everything," I said. "And I want to know how I can refuse all forms of financial support without exposing myself to legal liability." Francesca smiled for the first time in our conversation, briefly, but truly. "I've been waiting for you to say these words for years," she said. "Let's begin." "Let's start with the will," Francesca said, with that straightforward, matter-of-fact, unsentimental manner that had become an anchor for me in a sea of turbulent emotions, where resentment, bitterness, and detached determination crashed like waves on a rock. Over the course of 2 hours, step by step, with a methodicalness worthy of surgery, we reconstructed my estate plan, the house on Maple Street where I had spent dozens of Christmases, where the walls had held not only wallpaper but laughter, tears, kisses, and loneliness, would now be given to the women's shelter in Millbrook, the same one where I had begun volunteering 6 months after David's death, trying to find meaning in the daily grind, in other people's stories, in helping those who could still be saved. All my financial assets, investment portfolio, pension savings, dividends, insurance, funds, will also go there, in order, as Francesca said, to turn your pain into capital of female independence. My personal effects, so far from monetary value but precious in their own way, would be distributed among friends and neighbors with carefully written wills. The hand-embroidered blanket that had warmed Isabella when she was ill would go to her, the rose tea set to Agatha, whose friendliness had helped me through the January days. And for Camilla? Francesca asked, without looking up, but straining her voice as if preparing for an emotional outburst. I thought for a moment. My recipe box, I replied, and my journals. Let her read them if she wants to know who her mother was. The one she rejected, and the life she scorned. Delightfully petty, Francesca said, making a note. I approve. The next step was financial untangling, and for this Francesca enlisted her colleague Roberto, a somber lawyer with the voice of a lecturer and the tenacity of a hunting dog. Together they drafted letters to the banks that held the credit accounts on which I was listed as guarantor, and within an hour my signature on them was no longer valid. We sent notices to Camilla and Leonardo's mortgage company, informing them that I was no longer a secondary guarantor on their home loan. We closed the joint accounts I hadn't even remembered, the ones I had once opened, just in case, and opened new ones in my name only. They'll feel it in a couple of days, Roberto said. Their credit limits will be lowered, possibly zeroed out. Banks don't like instability. I understand, I nodded, signing the documents with a firm hand, without hesitation. The beach house closing is almost certainly going to fall through, Francesca added, unless they find a new investor. I remembered Camilla's voice. God, I hope it breaks, and their laughter, the ringing, hearty laugh that comes from something truly ridiculous. I remembered standing in their house, the smell of roasting garlic, holding a cake, dripping wet, thinking that love could be restored. So be it, I said. It's their choice. And now the consequences are mine. Before I left Francesca's office, I realized there was one more door to close, one important action that needed to be clear, so I called Martha Richards again. She answered immediately, sounding a little anxious. I wanted to let you know, I said without preamble, that I have removed all financial guarantees related to Camilla and Leonardo's accounts. Excuse me, she said after a pause. What guarantees? The ones used to take out loans, including, I believe, the loan on the beach house. But, they said you put half the down payment down. We gave the other half based on that agreement. I gave a short, bitter laugh. Well, Martha, I didn't do that, and I'm not going to. I thought you should know before it was too late. That night, back at the hotel, I felt no satisfaction, no guilt, no sense of triumph. There was only clarity, as clear as the air after a thunderstorm, when everything is wet and cold but you can still breathe deeply. I ordered room service, a hearty pasta with white wine, a small luxury I rarely splurge on, and ate in silence, watching the sunset touch the horizon in a streak of copper light. The phone had been ringing all day. Most of the numbers were unfamiliar, and I was almost certain that Leonardo was now calling from other people's phones, trying to reach me the way he used to reach banks. I didn't answer until I picked up the phone by accident. What did you do? Leonardo's voice was tense, his speech fragmented, full of panic. But not worry about me. Hello, Leonardo. I'm fine. Thanks for asking. The bank called. All the credit cards. They're freezing them. The mortgage is in jeopardy. And my mother. Martha said you called. Yes, I spoke to her. I wonder why you told your parents that I was contributing to the payments when we never discussed it. It was a misunderstanding, he said quickly. We need to talk. You may have misunderstood what you heard. No, Leonardo. I understood it perfectly. And everything I learned after that only confirmed that this was not an accident. It was a pattern. It was a habit. Veronica, please, he began, but I cut him off. No more pleases. No more Leonardo. No more manipulation. No more guarantees. I will no longer finance a life that has no place for me, except when my name is needed under the numbers. Give Camille a message from me. The woman she hoped to break has finally woken up. And I hung up. Then I blocked his number. Then I opened my laptop, clicked on the airline icon, and booked a flight home the next morning. And while 9 hours in a car in the rain had once brought me to the brink of collapse, those 90 minutes in the air now felt not just like a way to get there but like a crystallization point, a moment when everything clicked into place. I didn't have to suffer to deserve love, and I didn't have to pay to be heard. As I packed the clothes I'd bought in white plains, comfortable pants, soft sweaters, a coat that wasn't meant to impress anyone, into my old, battered suitcase that had carried me halfway across the country over the years, I felt neither young nor old, neither a winner nor a loser, but someone else, free, cleansed of the illusion of my daughter's unconditional love, of the guilt that had clung to me for decades, and of the invisible chains that bound me to people for whom I was valuable only as a signature on a piece of paper. The sky above the city cleared, as if the universe itself had blessed me with the beginning of a new chapter, and it wasn't just a consolation, but a sign, like after a long rain there comes a moment when the earth for the first time in a long time becomes truly dry and capable of bearing the weight of truth. At 78, I finally understood that some storms are not meant to be endured, to be gritting my teeth and sitting in a corner, but to wash away everything that no longer has the right to remain, deception, dependency, false intimacy, and leave only what truly belongs to you. The house in Millbrook greeted me with familiar sounds and smells, the soft tapping of shutters, the aroma of old wood and a few wilted flowers in a vase that Isabella had placed there, knowing that I did not like to return to emptiness. Everything was in its place, the photographs, the chair by the window, the bedspread I had knitted during my treatment, and the maple tree outside the window that David had planted on Camilla's birthday. But I was no longer the woman who had left this house for the last time. Now I moved through these rooms as the mistress not of space, but of my life. Mr. Darcy greeted me with his usual snort, then sank majestically to his knees, as if to make sure I was staying this time. Isabella, true to her word, brought a bottle of scotch, and we sat on the back porch, watching the garden slowly fade into darkness. "They've been ringing me every day," she said, raising her glass and watching the amber liquid swirl in the glass. Camilla had sounded startled at first, then annoyed. The notices must have started, I said, and she raised her eyebrows. What exactly did you do, Veronica? Everything, I said. Made a new will, revoked the guarantees, told Martha the truth. Isabella nodded without saying a word, and then, raising her glass a little higher, she said simply, David would have been proud. The first letter arrived 3 days after my return. The thick, cream-colored paper, Camilla's calligraphic handwriting, straight, beautiful, alien. The letter was formal, polite, but that was the bitterness of it. We had never written formal letters to each other. Dear Mother, it began. We don't know what's going on. You're not answering your calls. The bank said you're no longer our guarantor and our credit lines have been reduced. Leonardo's mother says you asked about a loan. Whatever you heard, you got it all wrong. It was a joke. Just dark humor after a tough week. You know how Leonardo and I sometimes talk. Please call. We're worried. Love, Camilla. No apology. No acknowledgement. Just distortion, an attempt to rewrite reality under the guise of anxiety. Gaslighting dressed up as concern. Financial fear masquerading as love. I folded the letter carefully and put it in the box where I kept Camilla's school drawings, as an addition to our family archive, only now as proof of the change. That evening, another unknown number called. I picked up the phone. The beach house closes on Friday, Leonardo said without greeting. The sellers don't want to wait. We need to reinstate the warranty by Monday. Hello, Leonardo, I answered calmly. I'm afraid that's impossible. Veronica, his voice sharpened, be reasonable. This is our dream home. We've been working towards this for years. Interesting, I said. Around the same time, you said you couldn't afford plane tickets to visit me for Christmas. There was silence. That was different, he said finally. Holiday trips are expensive. And a house for $500,000 isn't expensive? I answered, and then, without waiting for an answer, I said, Goodbye, Leonardo. I hung up and blocked the number. And again there was no triumph, no regret, only a firm, deep conviction that for the first time in many years I was standing on land that truly belonged to me, and no one else had the right to demand payment or submission from it. The next week brought with it a growing sense of despair, as if an autumn storm that had been gathering strength over the horizon had finally broken through, flooding everything around me with a flood of voicemails, emails, and paper confirmations. Each day I pulled another envelope from the mailbox, opening it with the same feeling with which a surgeon opens flesh, knowing that there is pus inside, and each document, be it a bank statement or a request from a mortgage servicer, confirmed one undeniable truth, that financial participation in the lives of my daughter and her husband was not a favor done in love, but a system into which I had been drawn so cleverly that I did not even realize how deeply they had taken root in my peace, in my security, in my name. Letters from Camilla arrived daily, in different formats but with the same content. None of them expressed remorse, no attempt to talk about what had happened in the kitchen, no recognition of the weight of the words spoken. Everything revolved around credit limits, payment deadlines, penalties, the impossibility of bearing such pressure without my signature. Voicemails from Leonardo ranged from saccharinely offended to outright accusations. He didn't seem to fully understand what he had lost, or perhaps he thought the loss was temporary. Even calls from their friends began, those I knew only by their last names and the casual handshakes at their parties, when I was introduced not as Veronica, not as a person with a history, but simply as Camilla's mother, without a glance or interest. They now called to express concern about my condition. One morning, a letter from the mortgage company arrived in my inbox, asking for formal confirmation that my secondary guarantee had been removed, strictly, formally, with a caveat about possible legal consequences. The next day, 2 different banks announced that Camilla and Leonardo's debts were being restructured. Their house of cards was collapsing, and I was proof. On Wednesday morning, a text from an unknown number arrived. Mom, please. We're going to lose the beach house. It's all for nothing. Is that what you want? I didn't answer, but the message was clear, even now, when everything had been said, when I had disappeared from their lives not with threats but with silence. Camilla was worried about the house, not about what was between us, but about the deal that was falling apart. On Friday morning, I called Beatrice, her best friend since college, someone I'd only briefly crossed paths with but whose sincerity I'd always admired. We met in a city cafe, at a table by the window, and I thanked her for coming. "Camilla is very upset," Beatrice said, stirring sugar in her cup. "She's sure you misunderstood something and are now punishing her." I smiled. "She said I misunderstood something?" "Yes," Beatrice nodded. "She thinks you overheard a private conversation and exaggerated it." I looked into her eyes. "I heard my daughter say that she hoped I would crash and die." Her husband laughed. "How do you think I should have taken that, Beatrice?" Beatrice was silent, her eyes widening slightly. "She didn't say that," she whispered. "She couldn't have said that." "She did," I answered, sipping my tea. And then, when I left, she started making excuses, as if I hadn't gotten the joke. "Did you know they'd used me as guarantor for several loans? That they'd taken money from Leonardo's parents, saying they couldn't afford to come to my house for Christmas?" Her silence was the answer. "I didn't meet you to complain," I continued softly. "I wanted to give you this." I put the envelope on the table. "An invitation to my 79th birthday. It's next month. Camilla and Leonardo aren't invited. But you are. I hope you'll come." As Beatrice left, shaken but not withdrawn, I felt neither remorse nor satisfaction, but peace. The truth, once spoken, creates its own justice. Later that day, a text came from Martha Richards. "The closing on the beach house has been lifted. They blame you. They're telling anyone who'll listen." "Thank you for telling me," I said. "I'm sorry they dragged you into this." "No need," came the reply. "George and I are starting to see them more clearly now. We should have listened to you years ago." It wasn't a victory, not in the usual sense. But it was an admission. An admission that I had been right all along. For weeks after I left their kitchen, the phone rang, Camilla's number. I answered. "Mom?" Her voice was shaking. "We were so worried." "And you?" I asked, evenly, calmly. "Of course. You disappeared. You changed the financial documents. You talked to our friends." "I heard what you said, Camilla," I interrupted. "About how you hoped I'd crash. About a guilt-free weekend." There was a pause. "It's not what you think, don't insult me with lies," I said, and in those words was the whole new me. Veronica, who finally understood the value of her name. She began to cry, and this time they were not the tears she used like a tool, with the skill that comes with experience, not the plaintive sobs that accompanied her requests for money, for understanding, for just a little more help, but real sobs, with ragged breathing and pauses that suggested fear mixed with vulnerability. "We didn't mean for it to turn out this way," she managed to say through her tears. "We were just under pressure. You call often, you always sound so lonely, and we feel guilty." "Exactly," I said, calmly, resisting the urge to lend a shoulder, because my shoulder was tired. "You feel my love as a burden, my calls as a duty, and my presence as something to be endured." "It's not fair," she whispered, but without conviction. "No unwanted, wish I were dead." I continued. "And yet you said it." And Leonardo laughed. We both knew it wasn't an accident, a joke, a misunderstanding. It was the truth, spoken in a moment when you thought I was not there. "What do you want from me?" she finally asked. I exhaled. "Nothing," I said. "That's exactly the point. I don't want anything from you anymore. Not your time, not your attention, not your ostentatious affection. I changed my will. I removed myself from all your financial obligations. I started building a life in which my happiness isn't measured by the number of texts I get from my daughter." Her voice rose, panicked, a thin, trembling note of fear. "You can't just cut us off. We lost the house. Our credit cards are maxed out. Leonardo's parents are asking how we're going to pay it all off. It doesn't bother me, I said. These are the concerns you consciously took on. Do you think I'm calling for money? She exclaimed. Yes, I answered without blinking. Because love has no strings attached. And every word you say sounds like a deal. I want to fix everything, she said, almost sincerely. I love you, Mom. Are you sure? Because love requires respect. And respect requires honesty. You haven't been honest with me for years, not in your feelings, not in your requests, not in your assessment of my place in your life. That's not true, she objected, but her voice wavered. When was the last time you came to see me for no reason other than wanting to be near me? When did you call not to establish rules of communication or to avoid a visit, but just to talk? When did you treat me not as a burden, but as someone you valued? Her silence was the best answer. I will no longer be your bank, Camilla. And I won't be the one you can only call when something is falling apart. If you want to maintain a relationship with me, it will be built on a new foundation: respect, sincerity, and unconditional honesty. And if I can't meet these conditions? Her voice became colder. The mask flew off. Then there will be no relationship. It's simple. You choose to be right, not to be a mother. No, I answered. I choose to be a woman with dignity. Family really does come first. But what you and Leonardo call family is exploitation disguised as debt. I don't have to love without reciprocity. I deserve better. It's all about money, right? She said sharply. You took revenge on us for the insult by hitting our wallets. No, Camilla. This is not revenge. These are consequences. For the first time in my life, your actions have collided with a reality in which I no longer pay for silence. Leonardo says you've always manipulated. That you control us through guilt. I laughed, for the first time in a long time, not out of anger or pain, but because the absurdity had reached its peak. Says the man who convinced me to sign the mortgage papers, hiding it behind words of love. You call that manipulation? The irony would be almost beautiful if it weren't so sad. 30 years, she whispered. 30 years of my mother, all destroyed by one overheard comment. Not destroyed, Camille. Transformed. I'm still your mother. I still love the girl you were and the woman you could have been. But I'm no longer the role you envisioned for me, a financial cushion and an emotional lightning rod. If you want this relationship to work, you're going to have to build it on the truth. And start by acknowledging what I heard. What if I apologize? If I say I'm sorry you heard that, will you reinstate the cosigner? Help with the beach house? And even as she pretended to apologize, I heard it. It wasn't an apology. It was an offer of a deal. And that was everything, why I couldn't, shouldn't, wouldn't go back to the old way. Goodbye, Camilla, I said quietly, and there was no threat in the word, no bitterness or reproach, only release, calm and deep, like warm water you dive into after a long cold. When you are ready to talk about me, about us, without references to finances, without expectations of help, without calculations, you know where to find me. I hung up without waiting for an answer, because I knew that now her answer would be an attempt to object, to convince, to regain control, and I no longer needed to hear a voice in which love sounded like an instrument of persuasion. I felt neither triumph nor defeat, only peace, rare as the last ray of sunshine at the end of a difficult day. Because for the first time in many years I told the truth, without fear of being abandoned, because I was already abandoned not in body, but in choice, abandoned mentally and emotionally, even before I decided to answer. Outside my window, unnoticed, while I was busy sorting out my heart, spring had arrived. The maple tree David had planted the day we brought Camille home from the hospital was budding, its buds slowly unfurling toward the light, as if nature itself wanted to remind me that renewal was possible, even after winters that seemed eternal. I looked at its branches and thought that this year I would plant tomatoes again, and maybe the asparagus that Isabella had talked about so much, plants that take time to take root but then bear fruit for decades. At 78, I still had time to grow something solid, something alive, something real. 6 weeks after I left the cake and walked out into the rain, I held a birthday party in the garden, not the pomp and ceremony in a rented hall that Camilla had once insisted on, but a quiet, intimate celebration that included my world, my circle, my choice. Isabella came with the potato salad that is legendary in our neighborhood. Francesca came, her red hair, as always, a solemn flag of defiance. There were the women from my bridge club, the ladies from the book group with whom we discussed not only literature but life, and those with whom I had volunteered at the library and then gradually distanced myself because Camilla thought I spent too much time on strangers. And Beatrice came, the one I had talked to in the cafe, choosing honesty over long-standing loyalty. She tried to stop me from coming, Beatrice said as we arranged cucumber sandwiches together on the silver plates inherited from my mother. She said I was betraying her by choosing you. But you're still here, I said. I'm here, she nodded. Because loyalty based on lies is worthless. Especially when you're asked to overlook cruelty. We ate carrot cake, not the one I'd made for Camilla, with marzipan carrots and childhood memories, but a new one, with grated ginger, orange zest, and cardamom, a recipe I'd rediscovered through experimentation, as I had with life itself. I served it on the same china I'd saved for a special occasion, but which had never seemed like a reason enough. Now I knew that if a day didn't seem special enough, you just had to make it so yourself. As the sun sank toward the horizon, casting a golden glow over my garden, Francesca raised her glass. To Veronica, who at 79 is braver than most 30-year-olds. To new beginnings, Isabella added. And to knowing your own worth. I looked around. These faces, some familiar for decades, others new to my life, looked at me not with pity, not with expectation, but with respect and warmth. This was a family chosen, built not on blood, but on a kinship of spirit. Camille's messages still came, less frequently, but as precise as drops of water wearing away at a stone. Mom, the mortgage company wants an explanation. Leonardo's car broke down and we can't afford to fix it. I didn't answer. Some lessons can only be learned through experience, and hers was just beginning. I went back to the library board, where I'd left when Camille had told me I needed to be more with my family, without specifying what she meant by that, being there when needed. I signed up for a watercolor class, a dream that had begun after David's death but that I'd put on hold because I still wanted her attention, her approval, her rare gestures of love. Now I knew, the most important love is the one you give back to yourself. But the most important thing I did in that year that turned so abruptly from downpour to freedom was to volunteer at a women's shelter in Millbrook, 3 days a week, in the mornings when the house still smelled of toast and apricot jam and the garden was filled with light like a cup of tea. Most of the women I helped were around Camilla's age, 30 and 40, some older, some younger, but almost all of them carrying the kind of pain that doesn't leave bruises but breaks your sense of self-worth. They were recovering from relationships that had destroyed them rather than built them, looking for work, a place to live, a meaning, a new I to replace the old, trampled we. I helped them with their resumes, practiced interview phrases with them, printed cover letter templates, and, most often, just listened to their stories of how, little by little, imperceptibly, from kind words and affectionate glances, they had come to silent fear and a sense of their own uselessness. You're not like the other elderly volunteers, one of the women, barely 30, told me as we sat together over her application to the store. You seem to understand. How can someone say they love you and yet hurt you over and over again? I've had some experience, I answered, without going into detail, because some things don't need to be deciphered. They live in the eyes, in the voice, in the way you hold your hand when you serve tea. When the director of the shelter learned that I had changed my will to leave the organization most of my assets, she invited me to lunch at a small restaurant on the corner. That's incredibly generous, Veronica, she said, holding the bill carefully in her hands. Can I ask why? I told her everything. About Camille, about that day, about the kitchen and the silence, about how I'd learned that love without respect becomes a promissory note that only one person can pay. Is this revenge, then? She asked, not with judgment, just with the clarity of someone who'd heard it all before. No, I said. This isn't about punishment. This is about recognizing value. These women are doing hard work, rebuilding their lives, brick by brick, with dignity. I want my resources to support strength, not dependency. In the fall, as the air grew cooler and the light sharper, I found a new rhythm, planting blueberries along the fence, as Isabella had suggested, joining a seniors group with whom we explored the local trails, sometimes soaking wet but laughing 3 times louder than any rain. Camilla sent a card, a generic supermarket card with glitter and printed text, and a gift card to a chain restaurant. Not a single personal line. Not a word about our last conversation. I texted her back briefly, "Thank you." Received. Warmth without surrender. That became my rule. Meanwhile, the consequences of her decisions were slowly but surely being revealed. From Marta, with whom I now met monthly for coffee and lemon pie, I learned that they had moved to a smaller house, sold their better car, bought a simpler one. Leonardo took a second job, teaching online. Camilla started working in real estate, a field she had previously despised, considering it beneath her master's degree. I was not happy about their difficulties. But I knew that while I was paying for the consequences of their choices, they were not learning anything. In November, when the first snow had settled on the treetops and the garden was silent under its crystal silence, Beatrice called me. "Camilla is pregnant," she said. "She's 3 months pregnant. I thought you should know." I thanked her, hung up, and for several days I couldn't untangle my own thoughts, a tangled ball of yarn in which joy, fear, longing, and a cautious, uncertain hope were mixed. A grandchild. Something I wanted but had stopped expecting. A new person. A new opportunity. Independent of everything that had happened. I bought a card, on good paper, without words, just an empty space to write my own. I wrote, "I heard your news. Having a child changes everything. Sometimes by its presence. Sometimes by its absence. I wish you the wisdom to discern what is important. If you ever want to build a relationship based on respect, my door remains open." I didn't write, "I love you," and I didn't expect a response. Some seeds take time to germinate. Some never. But I plant them anyway. 6 months after that rainy trip to Connecticut, I sat at the kitchen table in the soft light of a November morning, making a shopping list for Thanksgiving dinner. Isabella, Francesca, a few women from the shelter I'd grown close with over the past few months, and a couple of people from a hiking group with whom we'd repeatedly hiked short but scenic routes in the area, discovering the strength to keep going even when our legs were aching with fatigue, and there was something symbolic about that. I now thought, building new routes, new connections, a new version of ourselves, step by step. My phone buzzed by the coffee maker, an unfamiliar number appearing on the screen. I almost let the call go to voicemail, but something, maybe intuition, or just plain old curiosity, made me answer. "Hello, Mrs. Russo." The voice on the other end was smooth, polite, with a hint of clinical fatigue. "This is Dr. Leland at Hartford Memorial. We're seeing your daughter, Camille. She asked me to call you." My heart sank, like a belt had suddenly tightened around it. "Is she okay?" I asked, sitting up. "She's stable," he said. "She's been bleeding and is concerned about the pregnancy. We did an ultrasound and it came back good, but we decided to keep her overnight for observation. Her husband is out of town, and she asked me to call you specifically." "Thank you for letting me know," I said, and before I knew it, I was already calculating how long the drive would take. "She said," the doctor's voice grew quieter. "She said she apologized. But only if you still mean what you wrote on the card." I closed my eyes, giving myself a second. "Tell her I'll be there in 3 hours." The drive to Hartford was different, not in the meteorological sense, not because it wasn't raining this time and my knees weren't sore, though that was it, too, but because there was no longer any anxious anticipation or pent-up hope inside me, no warm anticipation or rejection, just a clear determination to be there, because this time I was being called, not to be saved, not out of calculation, but because someone seemed to really need my presence. Camille lay on a bed tucked tightly in white hospital sheets, pale, with a shadow of fatigue under her eyes, her hand resting unconsciously on her slightly rounded belly. When she saw me, her eyes filled with tears, not the kind that usually followed, "Mom, we need to," but quiet, human ones, as if something inside had let go. "Are you here?" she asked quietly, almost in a whisper. "You asked," I answered, sitting down next to her. We were silent for a long time. The monitors flickered with green lines, and muffled footsteps and the roll call of medical voices could be heard from the hallway. "I'm seeing a therapist," she finally said. At first it was about stress, after the beach house, the money, everything. But then, she looked at her hands, as if that was where the truth was hiding. It became something more. She started asking me questions that no one had ever asked before. "Why do I get so irritated when you call? Why do I feel like you're demanding something when you're just saying you miss me? Why do I allow myself to say terrible things about a person who's always only loved me?" She looked at me, her eyes clear, unwavering. I didn't have good answers, Mom. But now I'm beginning to understand. I was punishing you. For staying when Dad was gone. For being there when I wanted to be free. For being, in your simplicity, a reminder of what life could be like if I hadn't built it on expectations and showy success. She paused, then added, for loving me even when I didn't love myself. It wasn't repentance or confession, it was something else, a sprouting, a crack in the old shell. Financial problems, she continued after a pause. Yeah, it was hard. We took second jobs, reconsidered everything. But my therapist said that maybe this is the best thing that could have happened. Because before we were building a facade. And now, maybe we'll start building the truth. What do you think? I asked, softly. I think she's right. And I think you've known it for a long time. She reached out carefully for my hand, her fingers cold, but her grip strong. I'm not asking for money, Mom. I'm not asking for help. I just want to try again. Before this baby is born. To build something real between us. I took her hand, feeling how her skin, slightly damp with anxiety and tension, responded with soft warmth to my touch, and in this simple gesture, devoid of drama and unnecessary words, there was more genuine understanding than in all our previous conversations, because this is how, silently, with an open heart, real reconciliation begins. I want this too, I said, not promising the impossible, not smoothing over the sharp edges of the past, but simply confirming that I was ready to move forward if she really wanted to walk next to her. We did not decide everything that day, sitting under the flickering of medical lamps and the quiet beeping of machines, because real healing is not a flash, not an epiphany, but a process, slow, like the germination of seeds in dense soil, full of breakdowns, misunderstandings, and small steps towards each other. In the months that followed, we settled into a fragile but lively rhythm of communication, weekly coffee meetings in the small cafe between our houses, where the conversations did not concern money, guarantees, or old scores, but revolved around books, plans, feelings, attempts to understand each other anew, occasional family dinners, cautious as a step on ice, but each time a little warmer, a little closer to what might be called a family, if you set aside the years of pain. Leonardo, as I had expected, found the new state of affairs difficult to accept. His charm, so effective in the peaceful waters of a social evening, proved of little use in conditions where it was necessary to invest, not just to receive. But he tried, and I noticed it, even if I did not praise him out loud. As for me, I continued to live the life I had built in those quiet months, keeping the orphanage in my will, adding a trust fund for my future granddaughter's education, continuing to cultivate friendships that made no demands, only a choice to be there. My blueberry bushes, having survived their first winter, began to sprout green shoots, and my watercolors began to fill with bolder hues, as if I, too, were learning to express feelings in more than just words. Sometimes it seemed to me that I had changed not so much from pain as from the right to no longer pretend. The carrot cake I baked now was different, less sugar, more cinnamon, ginger, and cardamom, like me, less sweet, more savory, but whole in its own way. In the morning, as I was mixing the dough for a new recipe, my phone, left on the windowsill, lit up with a message. I opened it, an ultrasound image, a tiny profile of a baby, and underneath it, your granddaughter. She has your nose. I touched the screen, as if I could feel her, not yet born, but already real. Then I went back to knitting, knowing that everything I do now, every cake, every choice, every boundary, is not revenge, it is a future created from truth, step by step. Leave a comment on what you think about this story and don't forget to subscribe to the channel and put a like. See you soon.